The Double Shadow by Clark Ashton Smith. My name is Farpatron, among those who have known me in Poseidonis. But even I, the last and most forward pupil of the wise Evictes, know not the name of that which I am fated to become ere tomorrow. Therefore, by the ebbing silver lamps, in my master's marble house above the loud, ever-ravening sea, I write this tale with a hasty hand, scrawling in ink of wizard virtue on the grey, priceless, antique parchment of dragons. And having written, I shall enclose the pages in a sealed cylinder of orichalcum, and shall cast the cylinder from a high window into the sea, lest that which I am doomed to become should haply destroy the writing. And it may be that mariners from Lephera, passing to UMB and Piner in their tall triremes, will find the cylinder, or fishers will draw it from the wave in their seines of Byssus, and having read my story, men will learn the truth and take warning, and no man's feet, henceforward, will approach the pale and demon-haunted house of Evictes. For 6 years I have dwelt apart with the aged master, forgetting youth and its wonted desires in the study of arcanic things. Together, we have delved more deeply than all others before us in an interdicted lore. We have solved the keyless hieroglyphs that guard anti-human formulae. We have talked with the prehistoric dead. We have called up the dwellers in sealed crypts, in fearful abysses beyond space. Few are the sons of mankind who have cared to seek us out among the desolate, wind-worn crags, and many, but nameless, are the visitants who have come to us from further bournes of place and time. Stern and white as a tomb, older than the memory of the dead, and built by men or devils beyond the recording of myth, is the mansion in which we dwell. Far below, on black, naked reefs, the northern sea climbs and roars indomitably, or ebbs with a ceaseless murmur as of armies of baffled demons, and the house is filled evermore, like a hollow-sounding sepulchre, with the drear echo of its tumultuous voices, and the winds wail in dismal wrath around the high towers, but shake them not. On the seaward side, the mansion rises sheerly from the straight falling cliff, but on the other sides there are narrow terraces, grown with dwarfish, crooked cedars that bow always beneath the gale. Giant marble monsters guard the landward portals, and huge marble women ward the straight porticos above the sea, and mighty statues and mummies stand everywhere in the chambers and along the halls. But saving these and the spirits we have summoned, there is none to companion us, and liches and shadows have been the servitors of our daily needs. All men have heard the fame of Evictes, the sole surviving pupil of that Meleagris who tyrannized in his necromancy over Susfran from a tower of sable stone. Meleagris, who lay dead for years while men believed him living, who, lying thus, still uttered potent spells and dire oracles with decaying lips. But Evictes lusted not for temporal power in the manner of Meleagris, and having learned all that the elder sorcerer could teach him, withdrew from the cities of Poseidonis to seek another and vaster dominion. And I, the youth Farpatron, in the latter years of Evictes, was permitted to join him in this solitude, and since then, I have shared his austerities and vigils and evocations, and now, likewise, I must share the weird doom that has come in answer to his summoning. Not without terror, since man is but mortal, did I, the neophyte, behold at first the abhorrent and tremendous faces of them that obeyed Evictes, the genii of the sea and earth, of the stars and the heavens, who passed to and fro in his marmorean halls. I shuddered at the black writhing of submundane things from the many-volumed smoke of the braziers. I cried in horror at the great faunaces, colossal, without form, that crowded malignly about the drawn circle of 7 colors, threatening unspeakable trespass on us that stood at the center. Not without revulsion did I drink wine that was poured by cadavers, and eat bread that was purveyed by phantoms. But use and custom dulled the strangeness, destroyed the fear, and in time I believed implicitly that Evictes was the lord of all incantations and exorcisms, with infallible power to dismiss the beings he evoked. Well had been for Evictes, and for me, if the master had contented himself with the lore preserved from Atlantis and Thule, or brought over from Mu and Myopin. Surely this should have been enough, for in the ivory-sheeted books of Thule there were blood-writ runes that would call the demons of the 5th and 7th planets, if spoken aloud at the hour of their ascent, and the sorcerers of Mu had left record of a process whereby the doors of far future time could be unlocked, and our fathers, the Atlanteans, had known the road between the atoms and the path into far stars, and had held speech with the spirits of the sun. But Evictes thirsted for a darker knowledge, a deeper empery, and into his hands, in the 3rd year of my novitiate, there came the mirror-bright tablet of the lost serpent people. Strange, and apparently fortuitous, was our finding of the tablet. At certain hours, when the tide had fallen from the steep rocks, we were wont to descend by cavern-hidden stairs to a cliff-walled crescent beach behind the promontory on which stood the house of Evictes. There, on the dun, wet sands beyond the foamy tongues of the surf, would lie the worn and curious driftage of alien shores, and trove that hurricanes had cast up from unsound deeps. And there we had found the purple and sanguine volutes of great shells, and rude lumps of ambergris, and white flowers of perpetually blooming coral, and once, the barbaric idol of green brass that had been the figurehead of a galley from far hyperboreal isles. There had been a great storm, such as must have riven the sea to its nethermost profound, but the tempest had gone by with morning, and the heavens were cloudless on that fatal day when we found the tablet, and the demon winds were hushed among the high crags and chasms, and the sea lisped with a low whisper, like the rustle of gowns of samite trailed by fleeing maidens on the sand. And just beyond the ebbing wave, in a tangle of russet seaweed, we beheld a thing that glittered with blinding sun-like brilliance. And running forward, I plucked it from the rack before the waves' return, and bore it to Evictes. The tablet was wrought of some nameless metal, like never-rusting iron, but heavier. It had the form of a triangle and was broader at the widest than a man's heart. On one side it was wholly blank, and Evictes and I, in turn, beheld our features mirrored strangely, like the drawn, pallid features of the dead, in its burnished surface. On the other side many rows of small crooked ciphers were incised deeply in the metal, as if by the action of some mordant acid, and these ciphers were not the pictorial symbols or alphabetic characters of any language known to the master or to me. Of the tablet's age and origin, likewise, we could form no conjecture, and our erudition was altogether baffled. For many days thereafter we studied the writing and held argument that came to no issue. And night by night, in a high chamber closed against the perennial winds, we pondered over the dazzling triangle by the tall straight flames of silver lamps. For Evictes deemed that knowledge of rare value, or haply some secret of an alien or elder magic, was holden by the clueless crooked ciphers. Then, since all our scholarship was in vain, the master sought another divination, and had recourse to wizardry and necromancy. But at first, among the devils and phantoms that answered our interrogation, none could tell us aught concerning the tablet. And any other than Evictes would have despaired in the end, and well would it have been if he had despaired, and had sought no longer to decipher the writing. The months and years went by with a slow thundering of seas on the dark rocks, and a headlong clamor of winds around the white towers. Still we continued our delvings and evocations, and further, always further we went into lampless realms of space and spirit, learning, perchance, to unlock the hithermost of the manifold infinities. And at whiles, Evictes would resume his pondering of the sea-found tablet, or would question some visitant from other spheres of time and place regarding its interpretation. At last, by the use of a chance formula, an idle experiment, he summoned up the dim, tenuous ghost of a sorcerer from prehistoric years, and the ghost, in a thin whisper of uncouth, forgotten speech, informed us that the letters on the tablet were those of a language of the serpent men, whose primordial continent had sunk eons before the lifting of Hyperborea from the ooze. But the ghost could tell us naught of their significance, for, even in his time, the serpent people had become a dubious legend, and their deep, anti-human lore and sorcery were things irretrievable by man. Now, in all the books of conjuration owned by Evictes, there was no spell whereby we could call the lost serpent men from their fabulous epoch. But there was an old Lemurian formula, recondite and uncertain, by which the shadow of a dead man could be sent into years posterior to those of his own lifetime, and could be recalled after an interim by the wizard. And the shade, being wholly insubstantial, would suffer no harm from the temporal transition, and would remember, for the information of the wizard, that which he had been instructed to learn during the journey. So, having called again the ghost of the prehistoric sorcerer, whose name was Ebith, Evictes made a singular use of several very ardent gums and combustible fragments of fossil wood, and he and I, reciting the responses to the formula, sent the thin spirit of Ebith into the far ages of the serpent men. And after a time which the master deemed sufficient, we performed the curious rites of incantation that would recall Ibith from his alienage. And the rites were successful, and Ibith stood before us again, like a blown vapor that is nigh to vanishing. And in words that were faint as the last echo of perishing memories, the spectre told us the key to the meaning of the letters, which he had learned in the primeval past. And after this, we questioned Ibith no more, but suffered him to return unto slumber and oblivion. Then, knowing the import of the tiny, twisted ciphers, we read the writing on the tablet and made thereof a transliteration, though not without labor and difficulty, since the very phonetics of the serpent tongue, and the symbols and ideas expressed in the writing, were somewhat alien to those of mankind. And when we had mastered the inscription, we found that it contained the formula for a certain evocation which, no doubt, had been used by the serpent sorceress. But the object of the evocation was not named, nor was there any clue to the nature or identity of that which would come in answer to the rites. And moreover, there was no corresponding rite of exorcism nor spell of dismissal. Great was the jubilation of Evictes, deeming that we had learned a lore beyond the memory or prevision of man. And though I sought to dissuade him, he resolved to employ the evocation, arguing that our discovery was no chance thing but was fatefully predestined from the beginning. And he seemed to think lightly of the menace that might be brought upon us by the conjuration of things whose nativity and attributes were wholly obscure. "For," said Evictes, "I have called up, in all the years of my sorcery, no god or devil, no demon or lich or shadow, which I could not control and dismiss at will. And I am loath to believe that any power or spirit beyond the subversion of my spells could have been summoned by a race of serpents, whatever their skill in demonism and necromancy." So, seeing that he was obstinate, and acknowledging him for my master in all ways, I consented to aid Evictes in the experiment, though not without dire misgivings. And then we gathered together, in the chamber of conjuration, at the specified hour and configuration of the stars, the equivalents of sundry rare materials that the tablet had instructed us to use in the ritual. Of much that we did, and of certain agents that we employed, it were better not to tell, nor shall I record the shrill, sibilant words, difficult for beings not born of serpents to articulate, whose intonation formed a signal part of the ceremony. Toward the last, we drew a triangle on the marble floor with the fresh blood of birds, and Evictes stood at one angle, and I at another, and the gaunt umber mummy of an Atlantean warrior, whose name had been Oigos, was stationed at the third angle. And standing thus, Evictes and I held tapers of corpse tallow in our hands, till the tapers had burned down between our fingers as into a socket. And in the outstretched palms of the mummy of Oigos, as if in shallow thuribles, talc and asbestos burned, ignited by a strange fire whereof we knew the secret. At one side we had traced on the floor an infrangible ellipse, made by an endless linked repetition of the 12 unspeakable signs of Almer, to which we could retire if the visitant should prove inimical or rebellious. We waited while the pole-circling stars went over, as had been prescribed. Then, when the tapers had gone out between our seared fingers, and the talc and asbestos were wholly consumed in the mummy's eaten palms, Evictes uttered a single word whose sense was obscure to us, and Oigos, being animated by sorcery and subject to our will, repeated the word after a given interval, in tones that were hollow as a tune-born echo, and I in my turn also repeated it. Now, in the chamber of evocation, before beginning the ritual, we had opened a small window giving upon the sea, and had likewise left open a high door on the hall to landward, lest that which came in answer to us should require a spatial mode of entrance. And during the ceremony, the sea became still and there was no wind, and it seemed that all things were hushed in awful expectation of the nameless visitor. But after all was done, and the last word had been repeated by Oigos and me, we stood and waited vainly for a visible sign or other manifestation. The lamps burned stilly in the midnight room, and no shadows fell, other than were cast by ourselves and Oigos and by the great marble women along the walls. And in the magic mirrors we had placed cunningly, to reflect those that were otherwise unseen, we beheld no breath or trace of any image. At this, after a reasonable interim, Evictes was sorely disappointed, deeming that the evocation had failed of its purpose, and I, having the same thought, was secretly relieved. And we questioned the mummy of Oigos, to learn if he had perceived in the room, with such senses as are peculiar to the dead, the sure token or doubtful proof of a presence undescried by us the living. And the mummy gave a necromantic answer, saying that there was nothing. "Verily," said Evictes, "it were useless to wait longer. For surely in some way we have misunderstood the purport of the writing, or have failed to duplicate the matters used in the evocation, or the correct intonement of the words. Or it may be that in the lapse of so many eons, the thing that was formerly wont to respond has long ceased to exist, or has altered in its attributes so that the spell is now void and valueless." To this I assented readily, hoping that the matter was at an end. So, after erasing the blood-marked triangle and the sacred ellipse of the linked signs of Almer, and after dismissing Oigos to his wonted place among other mummies, we retired to sleep. And in the days that followed, we resumed our habitual studies, but made no mention to each other of the strange triangular tablet or the vain formula. Even as before, our days went on, and the sea climbed and roared in white fury on the cliffs, and the winds wailed by in their unseen, sullen wrath, bowing the dark cedars as witches are bowed by the breath of Terran, god of evil. Almost, in the marvel of new tests and cantrips, I forgot the ineffectual conjuration, and I deemed that Evictes had also forgotten it. All things were as of yore, to our sorceress perception, and there was naught to trouble us in our wisdom and power and serenity, which we deemed secure above the sovereignty of kings. Reading the horoscopic stars, we found no future ill in their aspect, nor was any shadow of bale foreshown to us through geomancy, or other modes of divination such as we employed. And our familiars, though grisly and dreadful to mortal gaze, were wholly obedient to us the masters. Then, on a clear summer afternoon, we walked, as was often our custom, on the marble terrace behind the house. In robes of ocean purple, we paced among the windy trees with their blown, crooked shadows, and there, following us as we went to and fro, I saw the blue shadow of Evictes and my own shadow on the marble, and between them, an adumbration that was not wrought by any of the cedars. And I was greatly startled, but spoke not of the matter to Evictes, and observed the unknown shadow with covert care. I saw that it followed closely the shadow of Evictes, keeping ever the same distance. And it fluttered not in the wind, but moved with a flowing as of some heavy, thick, putrescent liquid, and its color was not blue nor purple nor black, nor any other hue to which man's eyes are habituated, but a hue as of some unearthly purulence, and its form was altogether monstrous, having a squat head and a long, undulant body, without similitude to beast or devil. Evictes heeded not the shadow, and still I feared to speak, though I thought it an ill thing for the master to be companioned thus. And I moved closer to him, in order to detect by touch or other perception the invisible presence that had cast the adumbration. But the air was void to sunward of the shadow, and I found nothing opposite the sun nor in any oblique direction, though I searched closely, knowing that certain beings cast their shadows thus. After a while, at the customary hour, we returned by the coiling stairs and monster-flanked portals into the high house. And I saw that the strange adumbration moved ever behind the shadow of Evictes, falling horrible and unbroken on the steps and passing clearly separate and distinct amid the long umbrages of the towering monsters. And in the dim halls beyond the sun, where shadows should not have been, I beheld with terror the distorted loathly blot, having a pestilent, unnameable hue, that followed Evictes as if in lieu of his own extinguished shadow. And all that day, everywhere that we went, at the table served by specters, or in the mummy-warded room of volumes and books, the thing pursued Evictes, clinging to him even as leprosy to the leper. And still the master had perceived it not, and still I forbore to warn him, hoping that the visitant would withdraw in its own time, going obscurely as it had come. But at midnight, when we sat together by the silver lamps, pondering the blood-red runes of Hyperborea, I saw that the shadow had drawn closer to the shadow of Evictes, towering behind his chair on the wall between the huge sculptured women and the mummies. And the thing was a streaming ooze of charnel pollution, a foulness beyond the black leprosies of hell, and I could bear it no more, and I cried out in my fear and loathing, and informed the master of its presence. Beholding now the shadow, Evictes considered it closely and in silence, and there was neither fear nor awe nor abhorrence in the deep, graven wrinkles of his visage. And he said to me at last, "This thing is a mystery beyond my lore, but never, in all the practice of my art, has any shadow come to me unbidden. And since all others of our evocations have found answer ere this, I must deem that the shadow is a veritable entity, or the sign of an entity, that has come in belated response to the formula of the serpent sorcerers, which we thought powerless and void. And I think it well that we should now repair to the chamber of conjuration, and interrogate the shadow in such manner as we may, to inquire its nativity and purpose." We went forthwith into the chamber of conjuration, and made such preparations as were both necessary and possible. And when we were prepared to question it, the unknown shadow had drawn closer still to the shadow of Evictes, so that the clear space between the two was no wider than the thickness of a necromancer's rod. Now, in all ways that were feasible, we interrogated the shadow, speaking through our own lips and the lips of mummies and statues. But there was no determinable answer, and calling certain of the devils and phantoms that were our familiars, we made question through the mouths of these, but without result. And all the while, our magic mirrors were void of any reflection of a presence that might have cast the shadow, and they that had been our spokesmen could detect nothing in the room. And there was no spell, it seemed, that had power upon the visitant. So Evictes became troubled, and drawing on the floor with blood and ashes the ellipse of Almer, wherein no demon nor spirit may intrude, he retired to its center. But still within the ellipse, like a flowing taint of liquid corruption, the shadow followed his shadow, and the space between the two was no wider than the thickness of a wizard's pen. Now, on the face of Evictes, horror had graven new wrinkles, and his brow was beaded with a deathly sweat. For he knew, even as I, that this was a thing beyond all laws, and foreboding naught but disaster and evil. And he cried to me in a shaken voice, and said, "I have no knowledge of this thing nor its intention toward me, and no power to stay its progress. Go forth and leave me now, for I would not that any man should witness the defeat of my sorcery, and the doom that may follow thereupon. Also, it were well to depart while there is time, lest you too should become the quarry of the shadow and be compelled to share its menace." Though terror had fastened upon my inmost soul, I was loath to leave Evictes. But I had sworn to obey his will at all times and in every respect, and moreover I knew myself doubly powerless against the adumbration, since Evictes himself was impotent. So, bidding him farewell, I went forth with trembling limbs from the haunted chamber, and peering back from the threshold, I saw that the alien umbrage, creeping like a noisome blotch on the floor, had touched the shadow of Evictes. And at that moment the master shrieked aloud like one in nightmare, and his face was no longer the face of Evictes but was contorted and convulsed like that of some helpless man who wrestles with an unseen incubus. And I looked no more, but fled along the dim outer hall and through the high portals giving upon the terrace. A red moon, ominous and gibbous, had declined above the terrace and the crags, and the shadows of the cedars were elongated in the moon, and they wavered in the gale like the blown cloaks of enchanters. And stooping against the gale, I fled across the terrace toward the outer stairs that led to a steep path in the riven waste of rocks and chasms behind Evictes' house. I neared the terrace edge, running with the speed of fear, but I could not reach the topmost outer stair, for at every step the marble flowed beneath me, fleeing like a pale horizon before the seeker. And though I raced and panted without pause, I could draw no nearer to the terrace edge. At length I desisted, seeing that an unknown spell had altered the very space about the house of Evictes, so that none could escape therefrom to landward. So, resigning myself in despair to whatever might befall, I returned toward the house. And climbing the white stairs in the low, level beams of the crag-caught moon, I saw a figure that awaited me in the portals. And I knew by the trailing robe of sea purple, but by no other token, that the figure was Evictes. For the face was no longer in its entirety the face of man, but was become a loathly fluid amalgam of human features with a thing not to be identified on earth. The transfiguration was ghastlier than death or the changes of decay, and the face was already hued with the nameless, corrupt and purulent color of the strange shadow, and had taken on, in respect to its outlines, a partial likeness to the squat profile of the shadow. The hands of the figure were not those of any terrene being, and the shape beneath the robe had lengthened with a nauseous undulant pliancy, and the face and fingers seemed to drip in the moonlight with a deliquescent corruption. And the pursuing umbrage, like a thickly flowing blight, had corroded and distorted the very shadow of Evictes, which was now double in a manner not to be narrated here. Fain would I have cried or spoken aloud, but horror had dried up the fount of speech, and the thing that had been Evictes beckoned me in silence, uttering no word from its living and putrescent lips. And with eyes that were no longer eyes, but had become an oozing abomination, it peered steadily upon me. And it clutched my shoulder closely with the soft leprosy of its fingers, and led me half swooning with revulsion along the hall, and into that room where the mummy of Oigos, who had assisted us in the threefold incantation of the serpent men, was stationed with several of his fellows. By the lamps which illumined the chamber, burning with pale, still, perpetual flames, I saw that the mummies stood erect along the wall in their exanimate repose, each in his wonted place with his tall shadow beside him. But the great, gaunt shadow of Oigos on the marble wall was companioned by an adumbration similar in all respects to the evil thing that had followed the master and was now incorporate with him. I remembered that Oigos had performed his share of the ritual, and had repeated an unknown stated word in turn after Evictes, and so I knew that the horror had come to Oigos in turn, and would wreak itself upon the dead even as on the living. For the foul, anonymous thing that we had called in our presumption could manifest itself to mortal ken in no other way than this. We had drawn it from unfathomable depths of time and space, using ignorantly a dire formula, and the thing had come at its own chosen hour, to stamp itself in abomination uttermost on the evocators. Since then, the night has ebbed away, and a second day has gone by like a sluggish ooze of horror. I have seen the complete identification of the shadow with the flesh and the shadow of Evictes, and also I have seen the slow encroachment of that other umbrage, mingling itself with the lank shadow and the sear, bituminous body of Oigos, and turning them to a similitude of the thing which Evictes has become. And I have heard the mummy cry out like a living man in great pain and fear, as with the throes of a second dissolution, at the impingement of the shadow. And long since it has grown silent, like the other horror, and I know not its thoughts or its intent. And verily I know not if the thing that has come to us be one or several, nor if its avatar will rest complete with the three that summoned it forth into time, or be extended to others. But these things, and much else, I shall soon know, for now, in turn, there is a shadow that follows mine, drawing ever closer. The air congeals and curdles with an unseen fear, and they that were our familiars have fled from the mansion, and the great marble women seem to tremble where they stand along the walls. But the horror that was Evictes, and the second horror that was Oigos, have left me not, and neither do they tremble. And with eyes that are not eyes, they seem to brood and watch, waiting till I too shall become as they. And their stillness is more terrible than if they had rent me limb from limb. And there are strange voices in the wind, and alien roarings upon the sea, and the walls quiver like a thin veil in the black breath of remote abysses. So, knowing that the time is brief, I have shut myself in the room of volumes and books and have written this account. And I have taken the bright triangular tablet, whose solution was our undoing, and have cast it from the window into the sea, hoping that none will find it after us. And now I must make an end, and enclose this writing in the sealed cylinder of orichalcum, and fling it forth to drift upon the wave. For the space between my shadow and the shadow of the horror is straitened momently, and the space is no wider than the thickness of a wizard's pen.